What if the most dangerous royal secret wasn't spoken out loud, but written down, quietly, over time, in private? Let that question sit with you for a second. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because moments ago, at least according to rapidly spreading reports, Buckingham Palace acknowledged what it called an internal security review. No names, no details, just enough confirmation to send shockwaves across headlines, timelines, and comment sections around the world. And tied to that review is a rumor so explosive that even hardened royal watchers are struggling to process it. A hidden journal, allegedly personal, allegedly private, allegedly written by Meghan Markle during her time inside the royal system. If that sounds unbelievable, good. It should. But here's the part that's harder to dismiss. Palaces do not move, speak, or signal concern without reason. They are institutions built on silence, on restraint, on waiting storms out rather than feeding them. So why now? Why acknowledge anything at all? And why are so many insiders suddenly whispering the same word? Journal? This story doesn't begin with a book deal or a televised interview. It begins in the shadows, late nights, locked rooms, private thoughts never meant to be seen. Because history shows us something uncomfortable. Some of the most destabilizing moments for powerful institutions didn't come from speeches or rebellions. They came from letters, diaries, notes written when no one was supposed to be listening. Ask yourself this. If you wrote down everything you felt at your most isolated moment, would you want the world to read it? Now imagine that journal belonged to someone at the center of one of the most scrutinized families on earth. This is why the rumor alone matters. According to circulating claims, the journal, if it exists, contains deeply personal reflections, frustrations, observations, private interpretations of conversations that, in public, appeared perfectly polite. Some reports go further, suggesting the diary references senior royals, internal dynamics, and moments that were never supposed to leave palace walls. Important pause here. None of this has been independently verified. No pages have been produced. No direct quotes authenticated. Everything at this stage lives in the foggy space between rumor, speculation, and strategic leaking. And yet, something is different this time. Because usually, rumors burn out. This one hasn't. Instead, it's escalating. And escalation only happens when someone, somewhere, feels threatened by what might come next. Let's rewind. For years, the world has watched Meghan Markle through extremes. To some, she's a disruptor who challenged an outdated institution. To others, she's a symbol of conflict and controversy. But in every version of the story, one thing remains constant. Her inner life has always been the great unknown. Interviews show fragments. Public appearances show composure. Carefully chosen words reveal only what is safe to reveal. But journals? Journals are where people are honest. Sometimes unfairly so. Sometimes emotionally. Sometimes contradicting what they say out loud. And that's what makes this alleged discovery so volatile. Because if a private journal exists, it wouldn't be polished. It wouldn't be diplomatic. It wouldn't be filtered through PR teams or legal advisors. It would reflect feelings in the moment. Anger, confusion, hurt, maybe even resentment. Ask yourself, does private anger equal public truth? That question sits at the heart of this entire controversy. And it's why institutions fear private documents more than public accusations. Public accusations can be rebutted. Private writings are harder. They feel intimate, authentic, even when they're incomplete or emotionally exaggerated. According to whispers attributed to unnamed sources, the palace's concern isn't about embarrassment alone. It's about precedent, about control, about what happens if personal writings are framed as historical record. Because once that door opens, it never fully closes again. Think about it. Royal history is curated. Carefully. Selectively. Every archive release is negotiated. Every biography weighed. But a journal that surfaces outside that system? That's chaos. That's narrative anarchy. And that's why the timing matters so much. Why now, after years of tension, documentaries, books, and legal battles, would a journal suddenly reappear in conversation? Some suggest coincidence. Others suggest strategy, a distraction, a warning, or even a test balloon, released quietly to measure reaction. And then there's the most unsettling possibility of all. that someone believes the contents could leak, whether intentionally or accidentally. That's when institutions move. That's when language like security review starts appearing. Not because something has already happened, but because something might. Now, let's address another layer of this story that's making people deeply uncomfortable. The suggestion that the journal allegedly references not just emotions, but moments, private meetings, conversations, impressions that were never meant to be documented at all. Again, to be absolutely clear, these are allegations. Claims layered on top of claims. But even the idea raises a chilling question. What happens when memory becomes evidence? Human memory is flawed, emotional, subjective. A journal captures perception, not objective reality. And yet, once written down, those perceptions can be treated as fact by readers who weren't there. That's the danger, because the public doesn't read diaries as drafts. They read them as confessions. And if those pages contain unflattering opinions about individuals who cannot respond or who choose not to, then the damage isn't just personal. It's institutional. This is where the Queen's shadow enters the conversation. No alleged content has been confirmed. No verified passages exist. But even rumors suggesting private criticism of the late monarch trigger a visceral reaction. Not because criticism is forbidden, but because of timing, legacy, and reverence. Institutions protect symbols, and the Queen, for many, remains the ultimate symbol of stability. So when speculation even hints at private dissent captured in writing, it sets off alarms. Not moral alarms, strategic ones. But here's the contradiction no one wants to sit with. If the journal is purely fictional, why respond at all? Why not ignore it into irrelevance? History shows that the palace is exceptionally good at silence. It has endured scandals far more concrete than this without public acknowledgement. So when people notice even subtle shifts in tone, even careful phrasing, it feeds belief that something is being managed behind the scenes. And belief is powerful. Belief doesn't need proof to spread. It needs uncertainty. That's what we're living in right now. An uncertainty fueled by leaks, counter-leaks, and the internet's appetite for forbidden insight. An uncertainty that turns private pain into public spectacle. But pause for a moment and consider Meghan herself. If a journal exists, it was never meant for you, or me, or headlines. It would have been written during a period of intense scrutiny, isolation, and pressure. A time when every gesture was analyzed, every smile dissected, every silence interpreted as strategy. Journals written under those conditions are not neutral documents. They are emotional survival tools. Which raises a deeply uncomfortable question. Is it fair to judge someone by the words they wrote when they felt trapped? And yet, fairness rarely stops scandal. Scandal runs on contrast, on irony, on the tension between public image and private thought. And this story has that in abundance. Because for years, critics have accused Meghan of controlling narrative. Supporters argue she's been denied control entirely. Now, a private document threatens to upend both interpretations at once. If the journal is real, it suggests vulnerability. If it's fake, it suggests manipulation. Either way, someone benefits from the confusion, and someone loses. The palace, by design, cannot engage in emotional debate. It responds with process, with reviews, with carefully chosen words that say very little, and yet, somehow, say enough. Which brings us back to the moment we're in right now. A moment where no document has surfaced, but reactions already have. A moment where speculation is doing the damage before any truth is established. A moment where silence feels louder than denial. And as audiences, we have to ask ourselves something uncomfortable too. Why do we want this journal to exist? Is it because we believe it would reveal truth? Or because we crave confirmation of a story we've already decided to believe? Because here's the final twist that makes this introduction so unsettling. According to those hinting at what's inside, the most explosive part of the journal, if it exists, isn't about the monarchy at all. It's about betrayal. Not betrayal by the institution, but betrayal by someone Meghan believed she could trust. And if that's true, then the next chapter of this story isn't about royal protocol. It's about something far more human and far more dangerous. They endure them. They outweight them. They let headlines burn themselves out while the institution remains unmoved, stone-faced, seemingly eternal. That's how it's always worked. That's how it's supposed to work. So when even the faintest signal of concern emerges from inside Buckingham Palace, people who know the system lean forward in their chairs. Because something has shifted. Here's what made this moment different. Not a press conference, not an announcement broadcast to the world, but a phrase. Dry, carefully chosen, almost invisible to the casual reader. Internal security review. Those 3 words are doing an enormous amount of work right now. Ask yourself, how often do you hear that language used in connection with rumors? Almost never. An internal review suggests procedure, protocol, risk assessment. It suggests someone, somewhere, has decided that the situation, real or perceived, requires formal evaluation. And institutions like the monarchy don't evaluate feelings. They evaluate threats. That's why this first chapter of the story isn't really about Meghan Markle at all. It's about the palace. Because to understand why the alert matters, you have to understand how rare it is. For decades, Buckingham Palace has faced scandals that were very real. Documented. Proven. From leaked phone calls to family disputes played out in public, the institution survived by doing one thing exceptionally well: saying as little as possible. Silence is not avoidance in royal strategy. Silence is dominance. So when silence breaks, even slightly, it raises a question that no amount of spin can fully answer. What are they afraid of? Reports describe the alert not as a panic, but as precautionary. That distinction matters. Precaution means anticipation. It means preparing for a possibility rather than responding to a confirmed event. In other words, something hasn't happened yet, but it might. And that might is what's driving everything. Sources close to palace operations, again, unnamed, unverified, and often contradictory, suggest the review is centered on information control, not physical danger, not immediate exposure. Control of narrative, of documents, of access. That tells us something crucial. If the palace were worried about a leak already in motion, we would see defensive messaging, denials, legal positioning. Instead, what we're seeing is quieter, internal, almost invisible unless you know what to look for, which implies they are trying to stop something before it becomes uncontrollable. Now pause here, because this is where speculation often runs wild. People jump straight to conclusions, secret files, hidden vaults, dramatic discoveries. But institutional alerts rarely start with certainty. They start with questions. What exists? Who has access? Who might gain access next? And how damaging could perception alone become? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The palace doesn't need the journal to be real for it to be dangerous. It only needs people to believe it could be. Belief changes behavior. Belief drives media cycles. Belief forces responses. And belief is almost impossible to contain once it takes hold. Think back to other moments in history where rumors of documents caused upheaval long before their contents were confirmed. Sometimes the papers never surfaced at all. And yet reputations were permanently altered. That's the power of the idea of a document. Now consider how this particular rumor spread. Not through a single explosive article, not through a leaked photograph, but through whispers, through repetition, through multiple outlets hinting at the same thing without fully committing to it. That pattern is familiar to anyone who's watched information warfare unfold. It's not about proving. It's about planting. And once planted, institutions must decide: ignore and risk growth, or intervene and risk validation. This is where the palace finds itself now, caught between 2 bad options. And the choice they seem to have made, quiet internal review, suggests they believe intervention behind the scenes is safer than silence. But intervention always leaves traces. And people noticed. Royal watchers noticed subtle changes in language, in scheduling, in the way certain stories were neither confirmed nor dismissed. Legal analysts noticed a shift toward risk assessment rather than rebuttal. Media insiders noticed that some outlets suddenly became more cautious with phrasing. These are not coincidences. They are signs of coordination, which raises the next unsettling question. If the palace is coordinating internally, with whom? Security reviews are not handled by public relations teams. They involve legal advisors, archivists, and yes, security services tasked with protecting sensitive material. That alone tells us the concern isn't about hurt feelings. It's about information integrity. Because if a journal exists, or if someone claims to possess one, the palace needs to know whether it intersects with restricted knowledge. private meetings, confidential protocols, or even just the perception that such things were documented. You might be thinking, can a personal diary really rise to that level? History says yes. Personal documents have toppled governments. They've rewritten legacies. They've turned private grievances into public reckoning. And here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this chapter. On one hand, the palace is one of the most documented institutions on earth. Every movement recorded, every tradition archived. On the other hand, it relies on the assumption that some spaces remain unwritten, that conversations inside certain rooms are ephemeral, that emotions expressed privately die there. A journal violates that assumption, not by revealing facts necessarily, but by revealing feelings. And feelings, once public, cannot be managed like facts. You can deny facts. You can contextualize them. You can refute them. But how do you deny that someone felt a certain way at a certain time? You can't. You can only question interpretation. And interpretation debates are messy, emotional, unpredictable. That's why the palace fears the narrative more than the object. Now, there's another layer to the alert that hasn't been discussed nearly enough. Timing. Why now? Why not earlier, when tensions were arguably higher? When documentaries aired? When books were released? When interviews made global waves? Why does a rumored journal trigger concern now? Some insiders point to a simple explanation: succession, transition, institutional sensitivity during periods of change. When leadership evolves, institutions become more protective, not less. Others suggest something more strategic, that the rumor emerged at a moment when attention could be weaponized most effectively. But there's a third explanation that's harder to ignore, that the palace didn't know about the journal rumor until recently. And that changes everything. Because if true, it means information surfaced internally that forced a reassessment. Not public pressure, but internal awareness. Ask yourself, how would an institution like this learn of such a thing? Through lawyers, through intermediaries, through quiet inquiries that never reach the press. And if that's the case, then what we're seeing publicly is only the shadow of a much larger conversation happening behind closed doors. A conversation that likely includes one crucial question. Is this threat credible? Not emotionally credible, strategically credible. Does the person or people hinting at this journal have the means, motive, and opportunity to make it matter? Because rumors without leverage fade. Rumors with leverage explode. And leverage doesn't always mean possession of pages. Sometimes it means access to belief. Now consider this. If the palace were confident the journal did not exist at all, the optimal strategy would be silence. Let the rumor die. Let credibility erode. But if there is even a small chance that something exists, or that someone believes something exists, then risk management kicks in. And that's what this alert looks like. Risk management. Not confirmation. Not denial. Preparation. Which leaves us, the audience, in a strange position. We are reacting to reactions, interpreting signals about signals, reading between lines that were deliberately written to be unreadable. And yet, patterns emerge. The pattern here suggests concern, not panic. Awareness, not crisis. A desire to control the environment before it controls them. But here's the twist that complicates everything. Even the act of preparing validates the rumor in the public imagination. That's the paradox. By treating the possibility seriously, the palace inadvertently elevates it. And once elevated, the story takes on a life of its own. Which brings us to the final, chilling realization of this chapter. The palace alert wasn't triggered by journalists. It wasn't triggered by social media. It wasn't triggered by public pressure at all. According to multiple overlapping accounts, it was triggered by the possibility that a physical object, or something claimed to be one, had changed hands. And if that's true, then the story is no longer about speculation. It's about movement, about where that object is, who believes they have it, and what they might do next. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. A thing you can point to. A physical object that transforms rumor into something heavier, something that feels real. In this story, that relic has a name whispered with equal parts fascination and fear. The journal, or, depending on who you believe, the myth of one. Here's the first uncomfortable truth we have to face. No one has publicly seen this journal. No authenticated photographs. No leaked pages. No handwriting analysis. Nothing you could hold up in court or on camera and say, this is it. And yet, people are acting as if it might exist, which immediately tells you something important. The power of this object is not in its proof, but in its possibility. Because when institutions begin to behave as though something could be real, the public instinctively assumes it must be at least partly true. That's how belief spreads faster than evidence ever could. So where did this idea come from? That's where the story gets murky. Some versions claim it was among personal belongings. Others suggest it surfaced during a review of archived materials. Still others hint at intermediaries, third parties who allegedly came into possession of something they believed to be significant. Notice the pattern here. Every version removes direct agency. No one is saying Meghan released it. No one is saying the palace leaked it. Instead, the story floats in a fog of passive language. It was found. It surfaced. It came to light. That's not accidental. Passive framing keeps everyone plausibly distant from responsibility while still allowing the object to exist in the imagination. Now let's address the most important question of this chapter. If the journal exists, what exactly is it supposed to be? A diary? A notebook? Loose pages? Digital notes? The answer depends entirely on who's telling the story. Some insist it's handwritten, intimate, raw. Others suggest typed entries, possibly saved or recorded over time. A few claim it's not a single journal at all, but fragments, notes, reflections, personal observations collected over months. Each version serves a different narrative purpose. A handwritten diary feels emotional, vulnerable, authentic. A typed document feels deliberate, organized, potentially strategic. And the ambiguity allows people to project whatever version best fits their beliefs. Critics imagine calculated documentation. Supporters imagine private catharsis. The truth, if it exists at all, could be far less dramatic than either. But drama thrives in absence. Now consider why this alleged journal is so compelling compared to everything else we've already heard. Interviews are performances, even honest ones. Books are curated. Lawyers read them. Editors shape them. Documentaries are collaborative narratives. A journal is different. A journal implies no audience. And that's what gives it its perceived power. People believe journals reveal the real person, the thoughts they'd never say out loud, the contradictions they'd smooth over in public. But here's a fact we don't talk about enough. Journals lie, not intentionally, emotionally. They capture moments, not balance. They exaggerate pain. They simplify villains. They flatten complex dynamics into feelings that made sense at the time, but may not later. And yet, when read by outsiders, those emotional snapshots are often treated as definitive truth. That's the danger. Now let's look at another angle that complicates this further. If a journal exists, why hasn't it surfaced before? Why now? Some suggest it was intentionally withheld, that it was kept private out of respect, fear, or legal caution. Others believe it was forgotten, overlooked, or underestimated until someone realized its potential value. Value doesn't always mean money. Value can mean leverage, and leverage doesn't always need to be used. Sometimes just knowing it exists is enough. That possibility alone would explain the palace's sudden interest. Because an object doesn't need to be public to be powerful. It only needs to be credible. Which leads us to a chilling consideration. What if the journal doesn't need to be real in the way we expect? What if it's partially real, fragmented, misremembered? A combination of notes that, when assembled, form a narrative more cohesive than it ever was in life. History is full of documents that became more important after they were curated than when they were written. And that's where fear creeps in. Because once fragments are interpreted, meaning can be imposed. Now let's talk about who would want this journal to exist. That question matters just as much as whether it actually does. Media benefits from mystery. Audiences benefit from revelation. Critics benefit from confirmation. Supporters benefit from validation. But institutions? Institutions benefit from stability. And a journal, real or rumored, introduces instability. It invites reinterpretation of past events. It invites moral judgments about private thoughts. It invites debates that cannot be neatly resolved, which is exactly why institutions try to prevent private writings from becoming public artifacts. That's not about hiding wrongdoing. It's about controlling narrative context. Because without context, everything looks worse. Now ask yourself something honestly. If you were under intense pressure, misunderstood, criticized globally, and writing privately to survive emotionally. Would you sound fair? Would you sound generous? Or would you sound raw? And if someone found those words years later, stripped of context, would they tell the full story? That's the ethical tension at the center of this chapter. And yet ethics rarely stop curiosity. The journal rumor has legs because it sits at the intersection of privacy and power, of sympathy and suspicion. People want to know what was really said behind closed doors. But the truth is, even if the journal exists, we may never know what's actually in it. Because existence doesn't guarantee exposure, and exposure doesn't guarantee accuracy. But that hasn't stopped the next layer of the rumor from spreading. The claim that the journal contains more than just words, that it references moments, meetings, conversations, and that some of those moments may have been captured in another form entirely. Which brings us to the most unsettling escalation of all. Because if the journal is just the map, then what comes next might be the territory. And that changes everything. But what came next would turn quiet speculation into something far more serious. And no one was prepared for it. Voices don't. That single distinction is why the story took a darker turn the moment a new allegation entered the conversation. Not confirmed, not proven, barely even articulated clearly. And yet, once spoken, impossible to ignore. The suggestion that the journal, if it exists, references recordings. Let's stop right here and be precise. No verified recordings have surfaced. No audio has been released. No direct evidence has been presented. Everything you're about to hear exists in the realm of allegation, inference, and speculation layered on top of rumor. And still, the reaction to this idea has been intense. Because recordings change the rules. A written diary is subjective, emotional, open to interpretation. But a recording? A recording feels definitive, even when it isn't. People hear tone, inflection, pauses, silence, and they mistake those elements for truth. That's why institutions fear recordings more than accusations. Accusations can be debated. Recordings are replayed. So how did this idea even enter the narrative? According to several overlapping but inconsistent accounts, references inside the alleged journal hint at captured conversations or remembered exchanges. Some readers of these secondhand descriptions assumed that meant recordings. Others say that assumption snowballed online, turning metaphor into implication. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because the phrase recorded doesn't always mean audio. People record memories on paper all the time. They record impressions. They record feelings. They record how something sounded to them, not how it actually sounded. But once the word escapes into public discourse, nuance disappears. And suddenly, the story becomes something else entirely. Now ask yourself this. Why would the mere idea of recordings trigger heightened concern? Because recordings introduce questions of consent, of legality, of ethics, of trust. Inside institutions built on confidentiality, the assumption is that certain spaces are protected not just by walls, but by mutual understanding. You don't document everything. You don't preserve every conversation. You let some moments dissolve into time. If that assumption is broken, even hypothetically, it rattles the foundation. That's why, according to analysts, the palace's reaction would be less about the content and more about the precedent. Because once you accept that private conversations might be preserved outside official channels, every conversation becomes riskier. Now here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. If such recordings existed, why haven't they surfaced? Why leak hints instead of proof? One explanation is obvious. They don't exist. Another is more unsettling, that they exist but are too sensitive, legally complex, or ethically fraught to release. And a third possibility sits somewhere in between, that no recordings exist at all, but someone wants people to believe they might. Belief, after all, can be as powerful as evidence. Think about it. You don't need to release audio to make people imagine it. Once the idea is planted, audiences fill in the blanks themselves. They imagine tone, emotion, tension, and those imagined details feel real. That's how reputations are shaped without a single file ever being played. Now consider how this impacts Meghan Markle specifically. For years, critics have accused her of controlling narrative. Supporters have accused the institution of silencing her. The idea of recordings intersects with both narratives in uncomfortable ways. To critics, recordings suggest premeditation. To supporters, they suggest self-protection. Same allegation, opposite interpretations. That's why this story is so combustible, because it refuses to resolve cleanly. Now let's talk about legality, carefully and responsibly. In many jurisdictions, recording conversations without consent is illegal. In others, it depends on who consents. The legal landscape is complex and varies widely. But here's the crucial point. There is zero confirmed evidence that any illegal recordings were ever made. None. And yet the mere suggestion introduces a moral cloud that lingers whether or not it's deserved. That's why institutions act early when such narratives appear. Not to admit wrongdoing, but to contain implication. Because implication spreads faster than facts. And once people start asking, what was recorded, the next question becomes, why was it recorded? And then, what else was? This is how a story escalates without a single new piece of information. Now let's zoom out and examine the psychology of why recordings terrify powerful institutions. Recordings collapse hierarchy. On tape, a king and a clerk sound the same. Authority dissolves into voices. And when those voices are replayed out of context, power dynamics flatten in unpredictable ways. That's why institutions prefer minutes, summaries, official records, controlled language, sanitized memory. A raw recording bypasses all of that, even if it's incomplete, even if it's misleading, especially if it's emotional. But here's the detail that most people overlook. Even the allegation of recordings can force institutions to revisit protocols. Who had access to rooms? What devices were permitted? What policies existed at the time? Those reviews don't imply guilt. They imply caution. And caution is exactly what we're seeing. Which brings us to another uncomfortable question. If the palace is reviewing security procedures, are they doing so because of something Meghan did? Or because of something they failed to anticipate? That distinction matters, because it shifts the narrative from blame to vulnerability, from accusation to systemic risk. Institutions don't just protect themselves from people. They protect themselves from scenarios. And the scenario here, private experiences potentially documented outside official channels, is one they take seriously regardless of who's involved. Now think about how this story feels from Meghan's perspective, if you step back from ideology. Imagine knowing that private reflections you may or may not have written are being discussed globally. That people are speculating not just about your feelings, but about your methods, your intentions, your ethics. Imagine watching silence be interpreted as guilt, or strategy, or fear. No response satisfies everyone. Deny too strongly, and people ask why you're defensive. Say nothing, and people assume confirmation. That's the trap. And it's one reason why allegations about recordings are so effective. They create an impossible position for the person at the center. Because you can't disprove something that hasn't been shown. You can only deny the unknown. And denial rarely stops belief. Now, here's where this chapter takes a turn that makes it even more unsettling. According to some accounts, the concern isn't just about recordings of conversations. It's about how those conversations are described. Tone, interpretation, framing. Because even without audio, a written account can be read as transcript, as dialogue, as reenactment. And readers often forget that reenactments are reconstructions, not recordings. They assume accuracy where none is guaranteed. That's why institutions fear narrative diaries almost as much as actual recordings. Because they blur the line. They invite readers to hear voices in their heads. And once that happens, the story becomes vivid, memorable, hard to shake. Which leads us to the most important realization of this chapter. Whether or not any recordings exist is almost beside the point now. The idea that they might exist has already changed behavior. It's changed how people talk, how they speculate, how institutions prepare. And once behavior changes, the story enters a new phase. A phase where perception becomes the primary battleground. Because now the question isn't, were conversations recorded? It's, what would those conversations reveal if they were? And that question opens doors no one can close. But the recordings, real or imagined, were only part of the fear. Because the journal itself, according to those closest to the rumor, wasn't just about events. It was about people, specific people, and the contrast between how they appeared publicly and how they were experienced privately. And once that contrast became the focus, the story shifted from security to something far more personal and far more explosive. But what came next would push the narrative beyond whispers and into emotional territory no institution can easily manage. And no one was ready for it. They're rehearsed, polished, held for cameras, and released the moment the doors close. Inside powerful institutions, smiles become armor. A way to signal calm, even when everything underneath feels anything but. That's why the next turn in this story hits such a nerve. Because according to the growing rumor, the alleged journal isn't just about events or conversations. It's about contrast, the difference between what the world saw and what was felt in private. And that contrast is uncomfortable precisely because it's so human. Ask yourself something honestly. How many times have you smiled in a room where you felt out of place? How many times have you nodded along, said the right thing, played the part, then gone home and written something very different in your own private space? Now imagine doing that under a microscope. Every smile photographed, every glance analyzed, every silence interpreted. That's the emotional pressure cooker this chapter lives inside. According to second-hand descriptions of the alleged journal, again, descriptions, not verified excerpts, the entries focus heavily on emotional dissonance. Feeling welcomed and unwelcome at the same time. Feeling visible and invisible in the same room. Publicly, the images showed unity, grace, tradition continuing as it always had. Privately, if the journal exists, the tone is said to be far more conflicted. And that's where the story becomes dangerous. Because audiences are far more willing to forgive actions than emotions. You can explain an action, contextualize it, justify it. But emotions, especially negative ones directed at beloved figures, those trigger judgment instantly. People don't like being told that what looked warm wasn't, that what felt comforting to them felt suffocating to someone else. It forces them to question their own perceptions. And nothing makes people angrier than being told they misread a smile. This is why institutions depend on performance, ceremony, ritual, visual continuity. They communicate stability without words. But journals undermine that system by insisting on interior truth, or at least interior perception. And perception, once shared, becomes reality for the reader. Now here's the contradiction that keeps surfacing in this narrative. If the journal reflects private pain, then releasing it, intentionally or not, feels like a violation. But if the journal reflects private resentment, then keeping it hidden feels strategic. Same object, two moral frames, and neither is comfortable. This is why the journal rumor refuses to settle neatly into villain and victim roles. Because private thoughts don't map cleanly onto public narratives. They are messy, inconsistent, sometimes unfair. And yet, when people hear private insults or critical passages, they imagine malice. They imagine calculated cruelty. But anyone who's ever written through pain knows something else. Private writing often sounds harsher than the writer actually is. It's a place to release feelings, not refine them. That doesn't excuse hurtful thoughts, but it does contextualize them. The problem is, context evaporates when rumors spread. Now let's look at how this plays out with public figures. Public figures are expected to feel the right things. Gratitude, respect, loyalty. And when there's even a suggestion that those emotions weren't present, at least not consistently, it triggers backlash. Because people don't just invest in actions, they invest in perceived sincerity. So when the idea circulates that private writings allegedly contradicted public smiles, it feels like betrayal to the audience. Not betrayal of the institution, betrayal of expectation. And that's why this chapter matters. Because the real scandal here isn't what may or may not have been written. It's the realization that public performance doesn't equal private experience. And that realization threatens more than reputations. It threatens the illusion that institutions rely on to function. Now, let's talk about Meghan Markle specifically in this context. From the moment she entered the public stage, her expressions were scrutinized differently. Smiles labeled calculated, neutral expressions labeled cold, emotions interpreted through pre-existing bias. So if a private journal exists that contradicts public perception, it doesn't land in a neutral space. It lands in a battlefield already littered with assumptions. Supporters see validation, proof that what looked smooth was actually painful. Critics see deception, proof that what looked sincere was staged. And the truth, as always, likely sits somewhere uncomfortably in between. But the internet doesn't reward nuance. It rewards certainty. which is why this rumor escalated so quickly. Now here's another layer that rarely gets discussed. Inside royal life, emotional restraint isn't just encouraged. It's required. You don't vent publicly. You don't show frustration. You don't react impulsively. You endure. So where does that emotion go? It goes inward, or onto paper, which makes the idea of a private journal not just plausible, but predictable. The question isn't why someone would write privately. The question is why anyone would expect those writings to align neatly with public behavior. They almost never do. But here's where the story sharpens again. According to some reports, the journal allegedly didn't just express sadness or isolation. It allegedly expressed judgment. Observations about behavior, about tone, about how certain moments felt dismissive or patronizing. And once judgment enters the frame, the narrative changes. Because judgment implies evaluation, and evaluation implies comparison, which brings in another explosive element, hierarchy. Private writing that critiques upward, toward figures with symbolic authority, carries different weight than writing that critiques peers. It challenges the unspoken rule of deference. And even if those critiques are emotionally valid, their existence alone feels transgressive inside rigid systems. Now ask yourself this. If you felt misunderstood, would you write kindly about the people you believed misunderstood you? Or would you write honestly, even if that honesty wasn't flattering? Most people choose honesty in private, but private honesty becomes public offense very quickly, and that's the tightrope this story walks. Now let's talk about why this chapter unsettled the palace more than previous controversies. Interviews can be rebutted. Documentaries can be critiqued. Books can be framed as one-sided. But a journal? A journal doesn't argue. It confesses, or at least, that's how people read it. And confessions feel final, even when they aren't. That's why institutions prefer dialogue over diaries. Dialogue can be contextualized. Diaries feel absolute. But here's another contradiction that complicates this even further. If the journal is raw and emotional, releasing it would likely harm Meghan as much as anyone else. Private frustrations frozen in time rarely age well. What felt unbearable in the moment might feel excessive in hindsight. So why would anyone want this out? That question keeps circling back without a satisfying answer, which suggests something important. This may not be about release at all. It may be about leverage. The power of possession. The ability to say, this exists, without ever showing it. Because sometimes the threat of revelation is more powerful than revelation itself. And that brings us to the emotional turning point of this chapter. According to some descriptions, one alleged passage stands out, not because it's critical, but because it's vulnerable. A moment where the writing turns inward, questioning decisions, questioning belonging, questioning self. And that detail, if true, changes the emotional temperature of the entire story, because it reframes the journal not as an attack, but as a record of disintegration, of someone trying to make sense of an environment that never quite felt stable. And that's where empathy enters the room. But empathy is dangerous for institutions, because empathy undermines authority. It shifts the conversation from rules to feelings, from protocol to humanity, and humanity is unpredictable. Now, consider the audience's role in all of this. We are drawn to stories of hidden truth, of secret thoughts finally revealed, but we rarely stop to ask whether we're entitled to them. We treat private pain as public property the moment someone becomes famous, and that appetite fuels stories like this one. Whether or not the journal exists, the hunger for it does. And that hunger is shaping the narrative in real time. Which brings us to the most unsettling realization of this chapter. Even if the journal is never seen, even if it never surfaces, the damage and the impact may already be done. Because the idea of private thoughts contradicting public smiles has taken root. And once people believe that every photograph, every appearance, every remembered moment gets reinterpreted, nothing stays neutral, nothing stays simple. And that reinterpretation doesn't stop at one person. It spreads outward, toward others who appeared in those moments, toward figures whose reputations rest heavily on the assumption of warmth, fairness, and benevolence. And according to those close to the rumor, one figure in particular now sits uncomfortably at the center of that reinterpretation, not because of what was proven, but because of what was allegedly felt. And that figure's name carries a weight that changes everything. Because once the story shifts toward the Queen herself, the stakes move from personal to historical. And that's where the Real storm begins. But what came next would pull the past into the present in a way no one expected. And the consequences would ripple far beyond one journal. This is one of them. Because once the rumors shifted, quietly, cautiously, toward the Queen, the entire conversation stopped being about celebrity, conflict, or even modern monarchy. It became about legacy. And legacy is where institutions become most protective. Let's be clear before we go any further. There are no verified passages, no authenticated entries, no confirmed criticisms. Everything in this chapter exists in the realm of allegation, interpretation, and secondhand description. That distinction is not just important, it's essential. And yet, the reaction to these rumors tells us something profound. Even the suggestion of private criticism directed toward the Queen triggers an instinctive recoil, not just from palace loyalists, but from the public at large. Because for many people, the Queen is not just a historical figure. She is stability personified, continuity in human form. So when whispers suggest that a private journal may have contained unflattering thoughts, frustrations, or emotional reactions involving her, the response isn't analytical. It's visceral. But why? Why does the idea alone feel so unsettling? Because the Queen occupies a unique space in the public imagination. She wasn't just respected. She was assumed to be universally respected, loved, even by those who disagreed with the institution she represented. That assumption is powerful, and assumptions are fragile. Now imagine how destabilizing it feels to consider, even hypothetically, that someone inside the system experienced her differently. Not as a symbol, but as a person. Not as history, but as presence. That doesn't mean criticism would be fair. It doesn't mean it would be accurate. But it does mean it would be human. And humanity is complicated. This is where the narrative becomes emotionally charged in a way no press release can neutralize. Because private writings don't attack symbols. They respond to experiences. And the Queen, for all her symbolic weight, was still a human being interacting with another human being inside a rigid hierarchy. But here's the contradiction that immediately surfaces. The Queen was known, even by critics of the monarchy, for restraint, courtesy, and composure. So how could private criticism make sense? That question reveals more about expectation than reality. We expect symbols to be universally experienced the same way. But lived experience doesn't work like that. Two people can walk into the same room and leave with entirely different emotional impressions, especially when power dynamics are involved. Now consider Meghan Markle's position during that period. Knew, watched, interpreted constantly, navigating rules that were often unspoken, expectations that were assumed, not explained. And at the top of that system sat the Queen, not as a villain, but as the embodiment of the system itself. Which means any private frustration directed at the institution could easily feel, in writing, like frustration directed at the person. That distinction matters enormously, because critics often hear disrespect where the writer may have felt distance, confusion, or emotional disconnect. And supporters often hear pain where others hear judgment. That's why alleged passages involving the Queen are so volatile. They collapse nuance. Now let's talk about what is actually being alleged. Not insults shouted, not attacks, but private observations. Moments that felt cold, interactions that felt formal, emotional distance interpreted as personal rejection. Those are not crimes. They are interpretations. But when those interpretations involve someone whose legacy is carefully guarded, interpretation alone becomes dangerous. Why? Because the Queen can no longer respond. And that silence is final. Which means any narrative that touches her legacy carries asymmetrical power. It can shape perception without rebuttal. Institutions know this. That's why they move quickly, quietly, when such narratives emerge. Not to suppress emotion, but to protect historical balance. Now here's a detail many people overlook. The Queen's strength was her restraint, her emotional neutrality, her consistency. Those qualities created stability for millions. But for individuals seeking warmth, reassurance, or personal validation, that same restraint could feel distant. Both things can be true at once. But private writing rarely holds both truths simultaneously. It captures the one that hurts. And if a journal exists that captured that feeling, it doesn't mean it indicts the Queen. It indicts the emotional mismatch between institution and individual. But emotional mismatch doesn't sell headlines. Conflict does. That's why rumors of private insults spread faster than rumors of private confusion. Words get sharpened as they travel, and by the time they reach public imagination, they often no longer resemble their source. Now let's talk about why this rumor escalated rather than faded. Because this wasn't just about Meghan's feelings. It was about the Queen's image. And institutions protect images with extraordinary care. Not because they are fragile, but because they are foundational. The Queen's image underpinned decades of national identity. Any suggestion, however unverified, that her private interactions were hurtful threatens that foundation emotionally, even if not factually. So the response isn't emotional. It's procedural, security reviews, narrative containment, careful monitoring of how language spreads. Because once legacy narratives fracture, they're almost impossible to repair. Now here's where empathy becomes uncomfortable for everyone. If a private journal expressed frustration with the Queen, should that be condemned outright? Or should it be understood as the perspective of someone navigating an overwhelming system? This is where audiences split. Some see ingratitude. Others see vulnerability. But the truth likely resists both extremes. Private writing is not diplomacy. It's not balanced. It's not fair. It's a snapshot of feeling. And snapshots rarely tell the whole story. But here's the problem. The public doesn't read diaries as drafts. They read them as conclusions, which is why institutions fear them. Now let's address a subtle but crucial point. The Queen herself understood this better than anyone. She lived her entire life under the weight of interpretation. She knew how gestures would be read, how silences would be filled with meaning, which means, ironically, she might have been more forgiving of private emotional writing than the institution that protects her legacy now. But we'll never know. And that uncertainty is where this story becomes so fraught. Because the debate isn't really about what was written. It's about whether anyone should ever know. Now ask yourself this. If the journal exists, and it contains private emotional reactions involving the Queen, who is harmed by its release? The Queen's legacy? Possibly. Meghan's reputation? Almost certainly. Public trust? Absolutely. So who benefits? That question has no easy answer, which suggests that the threat may not be release at all. It may be distortion, the selective leaking of interpretation without context, the suggestion of disrespect without evidence. Because even unproven rumors can reshape memory. They can change how people look back on moments they thought they understood. And once memory shifts, it doesn't shift back. Now let's talk about why this chapter matters more than any other so far. Because this is where the story crosses a line. From contemporary drama into historical narrative. From personal conflict into national mythology. And mythology is defended fiercely. The Queen is not just remembered. She is curated. Which means any competing narrative, even an alleged private one, becomes a threat to coherence. And institutions value coherence above all else. Now consider the emotional toll on everyone involved. For Meghan, the idea that her private feelings, if they exist, could be framed as disrespect toward a widely revered figure is devastating. For the public, the idea that a symbol of stability might have been experienced as cold is destabilizing. For the institution, the idea that private emotional truth could undermine public myth is unacceptable. No one wins. And that's why this story refuses to resolve cleanly. But here's the detail that shifts everything again. According to those who claim to know the contents of the alleged journal, the most emotionally charged passages involving the Queen are not accusatory. They're reflective, questioning, conflicted, expressions of someone trying to reconcile expectation with experience. That matters, because it reframes the narrative from attack to struggle. But nuance doesn't travel well, especially online. So instead, what travels is the idea of insult. And once that idea takes hold, it triggers protective reflexes. Which brings us to the next escalation. Because as the Queen's name entered the rumor cycle, another name followed closely behind. A name that represents the future rather than the past. A figure whose public image is still being written. And whose perceived relationship with Meghan has already been the subject of intense speculation. That name is Kate. And when the story shifts toward her, the dynamic changes again. Because this time, the figure at the center is very much alive, very visible, and very much unable to ignore what comes next. But what came next didn't just add another layer to the story. It transformed it into something far more divisive and far more personal. Now pause for a moment. Think about the implications. Public perception, institutional protocol, and personal relationships all collide here. This isn't just about private feelings anymore. It's about how two prominent women inside the royal family are imagined, judged, and framed in the court of public opinion. According to secondhand reports, the alleged journal contains passages describing interactions, impressions, and conflicts, emotional interpretations rather than factual accounts, between Meghan and Kate. The emphasis is said to be on perceived slights, miscommunications, and moments that felt exclusionary. The exact wording is unknown. The context is unknown. And yet, the suggestion alone has created a storm. Why? Because private observations about living, public figures carry weight unlike anything else. Criticism directed at the deceased, like the Queen, gets absorbed into historical debate. Criticism of the living can explode immediately. It invites judgment, public debate, and backlash in ways that historical figures cannot experience. Think about it in human terms. Two women navigating the same institution, with the same spotlight, interpreting the same moments differently. Tension arises naturally. Misunderstanding is inevitable. But in a world where every gesture is photographed, every smile dissected, and every silence scrutinized, those natural tensions can become amplified. And here's the key insight. Private writing captures emotional reality, not PR reality. A journal records what was felt, not what should have been felt. And for Meghan, the pressure of being new to the institution, hyper-observed, and constantly analyzed, meant that even small emotional reactions could be magnified on the page. According to the claims circulating, the alleged passages involving Kate don't paint a picture of hatred. They paint a picture of tension, miscommunication, frustration, moments where Meghan felt isolated or misread. Moments that, if interpreted without context, could appear as personal criticism. That's the danger. Public imagination rarely tolerates nuance. Once the idea of private insults enters circulation, the narrative often solidifies into black and white storytelling. Villain and victim, aggressor and target. Emotional complexity is flattened. Human conflict becomes scandal. And then there's the timing. This alleged journal, if it exists, was presumably written during Meghan's early years as a senior royal, when public attention and scrutiny were most intense. Every misstep, every perceived slight, every awkward moment carried weight, not just for her, but for how others in the royal household were perceived. Now layer on the fact that Kate's public image is meticulously managed. Unlike Meghan, who entered the family later and was already a public figure, Kate grew up within the institution's orbit and was carefully prepared for public life. Any hint of criticism or tension, even private, threatens that carefully curated image. This is why the alleged passages about Kate, even if they are merely impressions or private frustrations, are considered explosive. They don't just affect perception, they threaten relationships, reputations, and institutional narratives. And it doesn't end there. According to some reports, the alleged journal may include descriptions of private interactions not just with Kate, but with other senior royals and palace staff. Observations about meetings, protocols, and informal moments that were never meant to leave the palace walls. Why does that matter? Because it introduces a new kind of risk. If those passages were to leak, they could be interpreted as a broader critique of the institution rather than just personal reflection. They could frame Meghan as hostile, manipulative, or disrespectful, regardless of intent. And that interpretation could spread globally before any clarification could be issued. The alleged journal, in this context, isn't just a private document. It becomes a weapon in the court of public opinion, a spark that could ignite decades of carefully maintained reputations. And yet, as with everything else in this story, uncertainty reigns. No pages have been authenticated. No proof has surfaced. The claims exist as a narrative echo, amplified by rumor and speculation. But that doesn't stop the palace from acting. Institutions cannot wait for proof to contain risk. Perception often travels faster than reality, and that speed can create crises before facts are established. Now consider the human dimension once more. For Meghan, the knowledge that private reflections about Kate could surface or be imagined to exist is intensely stressful. For Kate, the idea that private frustrations might be publicly circulated is equally fraught. Both parties are navigating a system that rewards restraint but punishes perceived missteps. And the public? The audience is drawn into the drama, constructing narratives, assigning motives, and filling in gaps. They are participants in the rumor's life cycle, sometimes unaware that their interpretations can have real consequences for the individuals involved. This chapter's central tension, then, is clear: the collision between private emotion and public perception, between personal truth and institutional narrative, between what may have been written and what the world believes was written. And as the alleged passages touch on more relationships inside the royal household, the stakes grow exponentially. Because now the narrative threatens not just individuals, but the interconnected dynamics of the family itself. But even as speculation rises, there is another layer that has yet to fully surface: the question of national security.